In the stillness of the Alabama night, a young man sat alone at a wooden desk too small for his ambitions, his hands pressed against sheets of paper filled with notes, questions, and numbers that didn't add up. The walls around him were thin, the hum of insects outside almost louder than the sound of his pencil scratching over the page. He wasn't born into the glittering halls of power or privilege. He was born into silence, into a world where dreams were too expensive to speak out loud, and where ambition often turned to dust before it even reached the lips. His name was Timothy Donald Cook, though to most people back then, he was just another son of the South, another boy, expected to settle into something ordinary, something predictable. But nothing about him truly fit the shape of ordinary. He carried questions that gnawed at him like a quiet hunger. Questions about what life could be, about how far the human will could stretch when nobody was watching. By day, he walked the quiet streets of Robertsdale, a town too small to remember, too humble to inspire confidence in futures. His father worked in a shipyard, hands blistered and weathered by steel and salt, while his mother, faithful and steady, moved through life with the quiet determination of someone who had no choice but to keep going. Their home was modest, warm, but weighted with unspoken truths, that survival was the real goal, not greatness. Yet for Tim, survival alone was a kind of death. He felt it in the pit of his stomach, the sense that if he surrendered to the smallness around him, something inside would rot before it had the chance to grow. He wasn't the loudest boy, nor the most charismatic. His power lay elsewhere, in an intensity that unsettled people who underestimated him. Teachers noticed, classmates whispered, but no one quite understood. He could spend hours staring at a single line of text, a single equation, not because he was slow, but because he was searching for something deeper: patterns, meaning, the hidden architecture beneath what everyone else accepted as surface truth. It was this obsession that carried him forward, though forward in those years meant simply finishing school, stepping into the unknown with more depth than certainty, and trusting that the sacrifices of his parents wouldn't be wasted. College was not a place that welcomed boys like him. It was a place of competition, wealth, and voices that carried louder confidence than his own. He carried his silence like a weapon, though at times it felt more like a chain. Nights were spent alone in libraries lit by fluorescent lights that buzzed above his head like flies around decay. He wrote, studied, and wondered if the sacrifices his own, his family's, were worth anything. His body wore the fatigue of someone walking a tightrope no one else could see. On one side, the abyss of mediocrity; on the other, the possibility of carving a place in the world. But the rope swayed violently with every test, every lecture, every moment. He felt smaller than the giants around him. It was here, amid the suffocating weight of expectation and self-doubt, that he began to realize the truth. Greatness does not announce itself. It whispers, it burrows. It demands a loyalty that borders on madness. And he was willing to give himself to it, even if it meant loneliness, even if it meant exhaustion, even if it meant standing in shadows for years before anyone saw him. Graduation came not as a triumph, but as a quiet exhale. A degree in industrial engineering, practical, unsentimental, a tool rather than a crown. He carried it not like a victory, but like a passport into places he could not yet imagine. But paper means nothing without risk. And the world was waiting to test how much risk he was willing to take. The first steps were brutal. Jobs that drained him, bosses who overlooked him, decisions that left him questioning whether he was building a future or merely renting out his years for scraps. There is a kind of humiliation that comes when effort outpaces recognition, when the fire inside you blazes, but the world looks away. He tasted it often. Long days at IBM, where he began his career, weren't the glamorous introduction to power one might imagine. They were filled with anonymity, with the crushing sameness of corporate halls where dreams drowned in cubicles. He walked those halls with a face others mistook for calm, But inside, the war was constant, the battle between patience and despair. And then came the moment of risk, the choice that would shape everything. To leave the safety of IBM, a place where security was guaranteed, for the uncertainty of a company that few believed in. It was a choice between comfort and hunger, between predictability and the possibility of collapse. Most people, when faced with such a decision, choose safety. Tim did not. He moved on to Compaq, a place rising quickly, a place that promised more, but also demanded more than most could give. He carried himself through it like a man with something to prove, though he never spoke of it. Words were wasted on those who couldn't understand. Action was his language, and sacrifice was the only currency he trusted. But even then, there was another silence waiting for him, the silence of being noticed, not for who he was, but for what he could endure. The truth of the corporate world was this: brilliance often went unseen, swallowed whole by politics and personalities louder than logic. He bore it with the quiet persistence that defined him, though every unnoticed victory, every unseen sacrifice, was another wound he tucked deep inside. And yet, the first victory was coming, fragile, uncertain, but real. It arrived in the form of recognition, not from those around him, but from those who mattered most. From visionaries, from leaders who saw not just the quiet engineer, but the mind burning beneath. His work began to carry weight. His decisions precise, calculated, unflinching started to shape outcomes that others could no longer ignore. It wasn't glory. It wasn't headlines. But it was the beginning of something. And beginnings, he would learn, are always the most dangerous parts of any journey. Because beginnings demand everything while promising nothing. They strip you bare, leaving you exposed to failure, ridicule, and regret. They make you question the ground beneath your feet, the worth of your own voice, the strength of your own resolve. And yet, they are the only door that leads anywhere worth going. In those years, Tim carried the scars of early battles few ever saw. He carried the loneliness of long nights, the sting of rejection, the weight of sacrifices invisible to outsiders. He carried the relentless question that stalks all who dare to dream. What if I am wrong? He lived with it, worked with it, slept with it, and still he moved forward. Because the alternative, staying still, was worse than any failure. The first taste of victory, though fragile, lit a fire he would never let go of. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't fame. It was simply this: proof that the silent struggle had meaning. That the hours no one saw, the doubts no one heard, the choices no one understood, had built something real. It was a small light in the darkness, but for Tim, it was enough to keep walking. And so, the boy from Robertsdale, who once sat in silence with nothing but scribbled notes and restless questions, took his first steps into a future he could not yet see. He did not walk with certainty. He did not walk with applause. He walked with doubt, with scars, with the weight of everything he had left behind, but he walked forward. And in that forward motion, fragile and uncertain as it was, lay the beginning of everything. The road ahead was never straight, and the truth is, Tim Cook never expected it to be. Success, he would learn, is not a ladder but a labyrinth filled with dead ends, hidden doors, and passages so dark you begin to doubt whether light exists at all. His path wound through companies that tested him in ways he could not have imagined, demanding not only intellect but endurance, not only patience, but the ability to carry wounds that never fully healed. Every step forward was also a negotiation with despair, with the constant whisper that perhaps he was not meant to rise higher than the floor he stood on. But still, he pressed forward, his silence sharper than any boast, his persistence colder than any defeat. At Compaq, he found himself surrounded by noise executives who measured worth by how loudly they could speak in a room, by how many eyes they could pull toward themselves. Tim was not one of them. He carried himself differently, speaking only when words mattered, choosing precision over spectacle. And while this made him invisible to many, it caught the attention of a few, the ones capable of recognizing strength in shadows. It was in this environment that the seeds of his future were planted, though no one knew it then, not even him. Because sometimes the most pivotal moments disguise themselves as ordinary days, and sometimes the people who change the world are the very ones the world ignores. But before the promise of recognition came the weight of rejection. Before the first real victory came the moments that nearly broke him. There were projects that failed despite his precision, decisions that backfired despite his caution, and endless days where he felt like a ghost in the machinery of someone else's dream. He lived with the quiet humiliation of being overlooked, of knowing his value, but watching others claim the stage. There were nights when the doubt became unbearable, when he stared at ceilings in lonely hotel rooms, asking himself the question that stalked him relentlessly. What if this is it? What if this is all I become? It was during one of these nights that the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Steve Jobs. Apple, a company on the verge of collapse at the time, wanted him. To the world, the idea of leaving Compaq, the rising star of the tech industry, for a company bleeding money seemed reckless, even suicidal. Colleagues told him he was insane. Friends warned him it would ruin everything he had built. The safe choice was to stay, to climb slowly but securely, to settle into the rhythm of predictability. But safety had never been the point. Tim Cook understood something few around him could, that true transformation is born from risk, that sometimes the most broken places are the ones with the most potential to be rebuilt. He listened to Jobs, and though fear wrapped around him like a cold shroud, he knew the decision had already been made deep inside him. He would leave safety behind. He would step into the fire. The day he walked away from Compaq was a day of silence. No celebrations, no applause. Just the weight of uncertainty pressing into his chest as he turned his back on everything he had earned. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a strange calm. Because the path ahead, however dark, was his. It was no longer about comfort, no longer about the approval of those around him. It was about something bigger, something undefined but undeniably real. He didn't know then that this choice would change the trajectory not only of his life, but of an entire industry. All he knew was that he was stepping into the unknown, and that the unknown demanded everything. Apple in the late 1990s was not the empire we know today. It was fragile, bleeding, a company mocked by competitors and abandoned by believers. Walking into its halls felt less like joining a company and more like entering a battlefield after the war had already been lost. Morale was low. Hope was thinner than paper. To most, it was the end. But to Tim, it was the beginning of something raw, something that demanded the very qualities he had honed in silence for years: resilience, discipline, and an unshakable calm in the face of collapse. The obstacles were immediate. Supply chains fractured, processes broken, financials bleeding red across every page. He inherited chaos, and with it, the impossible task of finding order where none seemed possible. Every decision he made was scrutinized, every risk amplified by the company's fragility. Failure wasn't just likely, it was expected. And yet, it was here, in the ruins, that Tim Cook began to build. He cut costs ruthlessly, streamlined operations with a surgeon's precision, and rebuilt the fragile bones of Apple's supply chain until the company could stand again. These were not glamorous victories. They were victories in the shadows, victories that lived in spreadsheets and late-night calls, victories that no one outside the company cared to notice. But they were victories nonetheless, and without them, Apple would not have survived long enough to become what it is today. The first signs of life were faint. A product that didn't fail, a quarter that didn't bleed, a small but undeniable shift from despair to possibility. These were fragile triumphs, easily dismissed by outsiders, but to Tim, they meant everything. They were proof that his choices mattered, that the risks he had taken were not empty. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had nearly forgotten: momentum. The sense that perhaps the impossible could be bent, reshaped, even conquered. Still, victory carried its own shadows. The closer Apple crept toward survival, the more weight fell on his shoulders. Every success raised expectations. Every decision became heavier, more dangerous. He bore it with the same quiet endurance that had carried him since his days in Alabama, but even he could not escape the toll it took. The hours were relentless, the pressure suffocating, the loneliness absolute. He worked through it all with the cold clarity of someone who had long ago accepted that greatness is not a gift but a burden. And though the world would one day celebrate him as a leader in those years, he was simply a man walking through fire, trying not to burn. The irony of success is that it often feels less like a rival and more like survival. The boy from Robertsdale, who once feared anonymity more than failure, now carried a weight heavier than he had ever imagined. And though his decisions would go on to save Apple, though they would build the foundation for one of the most powerful companies on earth, he never forgot the silence of his beginnings. He never forgot the long nights of doubt, the sting of rejection, the fragile taste of that first uncertain victory. They haunted him, but they also shaped him, reminding him always that the line between failure and triumph is thinner than anyone dares to admit. And so, the story of Tim Cook's first steps is not one of easy victories or glittering breakthroughs. It is a story of silence, of risk, of choices made in the dark without guarantees. It is a story of a man who walked away from safety into collapse, who carried scars invisible to the world, but carved deep into his soul. His first steps were heavy, uncertain, filled with shadows that threatened to consume him. But they were steps nonetheless, and each one pulled him further from the smallness he had been born into, and closer to the unknown expanse of what he would one day become. In the end, the lesson of his beginnings is not that success is inevitable, or that hard work guarantees reward. The lesson is darker, more human, that beginnings are brutal, that they strip you down until nothing remains but the raw will to keep going, that the first steps are always the most painful, the most uncertain, and the most important, because in those steps lies the quiet truth that greatness is not built on confidence or applause or destiny. It is built on doubt, on sacrifice, on the fragile, stubborn refusal to give up, even when the world tells you it's already over. Tim Cook's story begins not with wealth or triumph, but with silence, rejection, and risk. And perhaps that is why it matters. Because for every dreamer standing at the edge of their own uncertainty, wondering if the pain of the first step is worth it, his story whispers the truth no one wants to hear. It will hurt, it will cost you, it will break you in ways you cannot yet imagine. But if you take that step, if you dare to risk the fall, you might just find the path that leads to something greater than survival. You might just find the beginning of everything.